Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Carlos Lozano. I am Diplomacy Projects Coordinator at Iniciativa Climática de México, partner of Climate Transparency in Mexico. Climate Transparency is a global partnership of national experts working to provide the knowledge needed to inform climate action in G20 countries. At the recent 30th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, best known as COP30, in Brazil, Climate Transparency and its partners were present, releasing a collection of country notes to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. In this release, Germany was featured. Today, we are pleased to speak with our partners from Germany, from Germanwatch. So we have the pleasure of having here Thea Uhlich uh, from Germanwatch to speak about her national and global perspectives a decade after one of the most significant international agreements of our time. Tia, welcome. To begin, could you briefly introduce yourself and your role in climate policy?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Great that we have the opportunity to talk today, Carlos. So I'm Thea Uhlich, and I work as a policy advisor for low carbon strategies and energy at Germanwatch. And we are a development, environmental, and a human rights organization based in Germany. And I've been with Germanwatch for 5 years now, and my main project is the Climate Change Performance Index, or short CCPI, and it compares 63 countries and the EU and looks at how ambitious governments are on climate action. And even before joining Germanwatch, climate change was like a central topic for me during my university studies and through various work experiences.
Thank you, Tia. And just on that, if you could tell us a little bit about how your own perspective has evolved since you started working on these issues.
Yeah, so over the years, what becomes really clear to me is how deeply climate change is connected to almost everything else, like politics, society, and the economy. And that means you just can't tackle climate change in a silo. So it needs international cooperation, but it also needs engagement across society, from governments and businesses to civil society and individuals. And I started working on climate issues around the time the Paris Agreement was adopted. And I actually remembered preparing a university presentation in early 2015 on, I think, German and EU climate targets. And I said back then that the next COP would be crucial, not just for Europe, but globally. And it really was. So this was like a very, very strong point for me to come into the climate action bubble. And I think with the Paris Agreement and the introduction of nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, we now have a framework that in theory could keep global warming well below 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees. And the challenge since then hasn't been a lack of agreements, it's been a lack of implementation. And the impacts of climate change are becoming more and more visible every year.
Thank you, Tia. That's very interesting to hear how you've developed your professional career along with the development of this international framework. So to see that you have that very clear, very young perspective is, I think, a breath of fresh air for a lot of our listeners. So from that, I do want to ask you a little about how you think that a decade from the Paris Agreement, if you can tell us a little bit about, in this perspective of 10 years, having analyzed the agreement and the negotiations 10 years ago, a decade ago, if you could tell me about what stands out to you as the most significant shifts in your country's climate decision making.
So when I look back over the past 10 years, climate policy in Germany feels almost like a roller coaster. Sometimes it's very high on the agenda, the topic, and sometimes it slips down again, depending on, basically political priorities and which government is ruling and what's happening in the world. But I think the Paris Agreement really changed that because after 2015, climate policy clearly moved to the center of decision making in Germany, especially in the beginning, in the first years, so between 2015 and 2020. And it really is a central reference point in diverse policy decision making stuff and in targets. And so the Paris Agreement really helped moving things here in Germany. And we've seen some key breakthroughs after the Paris Agreement. For example, our first climate law in 2019, which made our climate targets legally binding. Then we had the coal phase-out law in 2020. and a court ruling in 2021. And that ruling really was huge because it made clear that climate mitigation can't be shifted into future generations. And the government had to adjust the climate law and make it more ambitious. And I think the Paris Agreement really, really helped making that point, how important climate action is for this court ruling even. And at the same time, when we look at Germany's like Energiewende, it shows like both sides of the story, because in Germany we were pioneers in renewable energy 25 years ago, and then lost momentum due to political decisions and mainly due to political decisions, and only recently picked up speed again when it comes to renewables. And I really want to emphasize that Germany is the third largest economy, and being the third largest economy really comes with a special responsibility, I think. And it's not just about setting ambitious targets, it's really about delivering on them, yes.
It's very interesting to hear, Thea, especially that I think a lot of countries in the G20 and in climate transparency, we can relate to that roller coaster analogy. I do think that sometimes there's these moments where there's these highs and then these lows. It's more important, more visible, and then suddenly it seems either to have been forgotten because of other priorities, or maybe there's just simply not an interest in uptaking climate. So that's a very useful insight. But perhaps something that you mentioned, I do want to follow up, because I wanted to ask you if in these 10 years, if you could recall a pivotal moment that marked a turning point. But you mentioned two. You talked about this ruling about the importance of climate mitigation, but you also spoke a little bit about how Germany lost momentum in the leadership for renewables, being a leader a few decades back. Due to political reasons, they stopped being a leader and then trying to get back. That was interesting, but also the Paris Agreement. So I think that it's a very clear perspective from the inside. And from the outside, a lot of people that are not in Germany or familiar with German politics or economy would probably say that the invasion of Ukraine from Russia would probably have been a pivotal moment. So if you were to choose maybe one that's most important for the climate space, for the climate negotiation, or for the Paris Agreement implementation, as you said, it was the biggest challenge. What would you say would be the most important one of all of these that marked a turning point in Germany?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say there's like one turning point for Germany's climate policy over the last 10 years, but it was more like a gathering of all the small moments maybe you also mentioned, but maybe I can add even two more to the ones I said before. So for me, one real turning point here was the Fridays for Future movement in Germany, starting around 2019, I would say. And in Germany, it became especially strong, and it mobilized not only young people, mostly young people, but not only, but also adults across society. So we have like grandmas for future, we have doctors for future, we have teachers for future here, and they are still active, not in that big action as it was like 6 years ago, but they are still active. And I think seeing so many people demand climate action put enormous pressure on policymakers, and it really showed how social movements can shape national climate policy. And another moment that really brought the urgency home was the 2021 flood disaster in the Ahr Valley. And it was a stark reminder that climate change doesn't just happen elsewhere, it can hit Germany too, and that with devastating consequences. And events like that make it clear that acting on climate isn't optional, and that they add weight to the public demand for stronger and faster policies. So I'm very sorry, Carlos, that I cannot decide on one pivotal point, and I even had to add two more.
Thank you. That's okay. I understand that it is really a mixture of things and a collection of circumstances. That's something that I think may contrast with some other country cases where it's a specific moment or something that happened that changes the calculation in the entirety. And so moving on from this, I think keeping this into perspective, we have to look ahead, not just look back into the pivotal moments of the past, but also look into what can change in the future. So looking ahead to COP 31, right? So the meeting for this year and also for the next decade, for the second decade of the Paris Agreement. What do you think? You've mentioned implementation, right? That's one of the most important challenges. But what do you think is the most important thing that in the next decade the international community should address, both in COP31, but also in the following decade? Well, I want to assume COP40, right? But well, we're not sure if that's really going to happen. What do you think?
So looking ahead to COP31 and the next decade, I think I want to highlight three critical topics we need to address. And I think there are more, but I think these three really stand out to me. And first, it's international climate finance. So the impacts of climate change are already hitting countries everywhere. We see floods, we see droughts, we see extreme weather. I just mentioned the R Valley catastrophe in 2021. And adaptation and loss and damage are becoming more urgent. And right now, climate finance payments are far too low, and they don't reflect the scale of the challenge at all and aren't enough to help the most vulnerable countries. And I think historically responsible economies really need to step up and provide predictable and long-term funding, because I want to be really clear on that investing in climate finance isn't charity. It prevents humanitarian crises and strengthens global stability and reduces the risk of tipping points that affect all of us. So I think international climate finance, I mean, it already is one central part of the COPs, but it really need to be on the top of the agenda also in the next years. And the second one would be the UNFCCC reform. So the first Paris Agreement cycle has ended, and the next global stocktake is starting at COP31. And this is our chance to assess progress and increase ambition. But many of the new NDCs are not out yet or fall short of what's needed to meet the 1.5 limit. And so we need also to think about reforms that can ensure that COPs produce good results that strengthen accountability and that give countries clear pathways to increase ambition. And I think transparency, monitoring, and support for countries struggling to implement commitments are key. And COPs really have to drive real-world change, and to think about how we can manage to do that will also be like one central point, I think, in the next years. And lastly, we already talked about it, is the implementation and ambition gap and how we can close them. And for me, again, that means three things. First, putting the phase out of fossil fuels at the very center of political decisions, ending subsidies and stopping new coal, oil, and gas infrastructure. Second, accelerating renewable energy deployment, including grid and storage infrastructure, and making sure systems can handle widespread electrification. And electrification would then be the third point. I think in all sectors, transport, industry, buildings, it's possible, but they need clear policies and investments and political will. So without these steps, we risk falling behind on commitments we've already made.
Thank you, Thea. From what you've told me, what these three priorities that you think the world, the international community should focus on: climate finance, UNFCCC reform, and the closing of the implementation and ambition gaps. I think these are definitely important. However, I think it's a challenging political environment this following decade. At the start, right now. I mean, just on the beginning of this year, as I'm sure you've read, and by when we started, this is the second interview of the series of interviews. Just when we had the first one to the second one, there's been some interesting changes in the architectures. Most importantly, the United States has left the UNFCCC, so that's quite a shock for a lot of people. They ended funding and their participation inside the GCF. They hadn't funded it for a while, but now they've officially left, and they left the board presidency that they had already. So that's already quite important, and also the retreat of that important country from a lot of multilaterals. And I think a lot of this comes from their domestic policy, which stems from a lot of domestic politics, which we've seen around the world occurring. So it's not just a US phenomenon, but it's taken place all over. And I want to ask you specifically about it. Climate negationism. It's grown, and that's unquestionable. But what do you think is the cause of it, and what do you think climate transparency could do about it? And I'm asking this because eventually it does depend on each of the countries, societies, and politics to be able to bring to the table political will to be able to implement these priorities that you've mentioned, countries will hardly allocate funding for international climate finance if they are not internally convinced this is important. If they deny climate, well, they're not going to put any money, in front. And it's the same for the multilateral system reform. I think the United States rhetoric puts it clearly. They say that that it has to benefit the America. You know how they frame it. America has to benefit America first. So if this spreads to more countries, it's going to be more challenging to get anything done in the UNFCCC, and the same for closing the gaps. So what do you think is the cause of this negationism? And through climate transparency, what do you think we could do about it?
So I think the rise of climate negationism doesn't happen by accident. So there are still actors who profit from the sale of fossil fuels, and they want to prolong their fossil fuel business model. So it's basically about money and influence. And if you look back, I mean, since the 1970s, they have actively worked to undermine effective climate policy. And mostly these are fossil fuel companies, but also political decision makers who are making also money with like selling fossil fuels. And they do this through targeted disinformation, withholding research, influencing political decision makers, and funding climate skepticism and right-wing populist actors. And I think this is a very interesting point, and it shows that climate action and democracy are closely intertwined. And strong democratic institutions are essential to make effective climate policy possible. And I think that's exactly what we see in the US right now, right? And I think one crucial step is informed political decision making, which counters these disinformation campaigns. And climate transparency can contribute, or already had contributed in the past years, to that by providing scientifically based information, but maybe even more important by telling stories and creating counter narratives that make the issue tangible and relatable. And another important aspect that I want to mention about climate transparency is the networking aspect, because as a network of the G20 countries, climate transparency can serve as a bridge and allowing countries to learn from each other, sharing what works, what doesn't work, and how policies are being implemented elsewhere. And I think that was a strength always from climate transparency, and is even more important in times like that. And this exchange strengthens global understanding and helps build momentum for more ambitious climate action.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of us we share that call for climate transparency to be able to provide a lot of what you've mentioned to better inform. I think not just decision makers, but basically everyone around the world. And I think that's definitely an important role. And if I may, I do want to ask you an additional follow up on UNFCCC reform. And I'm going to focus on this one because I think you may have a specific perspective. If you could share a little bit more about it. You told me that you think that it's important that the system is reformed in such a way that it delivers better. But if you can tell us a little bit about what's your perspective on what the reform perhaps could look like or what it should aim to achieve, just to get more clarity on that point.
Yes, sure. I mean, I think there are different ways on how to reshape the UNFCCC. I mean, for a long time, it was really about negotiating an agreement that could stop climate change or limit climate change. And with the Paris Agreement, we basically made that. We don't need a next agreement. So with the Paris Agreement, we can theoretically solve the climate crisis or limit the climate crisis. And now I think the UNFCCC process need to be adjusted to go into this next phase of UNFCCC, not negotiating the Paris Agreement, but really go into implementation and monitoring and supporting countries that needs more support, for example, and that the COPs should be more about like strengthening accountability and really looking at the ratcheting up mechanism that was agreed on in the Paris Agreement with like the NDCs, the GST and stuff like that, and not negotiating again and again the same stuff, but really like, and then having at the end like an I don't know, a text where they just say the same things over and over again. I mean, it's good that they can agree on something, I would say that, but I think it's also important to think about ways how COPs really can be a driver for more ambitious climate action and what the core points of UNFCCC should be. Yes.
Thank you, Tia. So let's move on and let's bring this down from the large multilateral international negotiation table. Let's go back to Germany. And I want to drive down this point that you've made on the challenges for implementation. I think for our audience, as you mentioned, climate transparency tries to put into perspective each country's actions. We talk a lot about the challenges, but also I think it's important to draw on the lessons of successes. So I do want to ask you about implementation. If you could tell us a little bit about where you think that implementation has genuinely improved in your country, specifically, the perspective of 10 years, and where you think it's fallen short.
Sure. So if we look at the different sectors, we see some clear patterns. So buildings and transport sector really are the trouble spots in Germany, and they have been for years because emissions there just aren't dropping fast enough. Because we still don't have clear strategies or strong measures in these sectors. And this is also, we talked about that before, because of powerful lobby groups that are part of the reason that we don't have this strong policies. Other sectors are doing better. Agriculture, waste management, and industry are more on track. I mean, there's still some potential for doing better, and the energy sector is really leading the way. I think, like in many other countries in the world, and the expansion of renewable in recent years had made a big difference. And that, but saying that, there are also challenges also in these sectors. I mean, we have heat pumps that are not being adopted fast enough. Electric vehicles aren't scaling fast enough, and we are still too dependent on fossil fuels in some areas. So we need smart policies to hit both short and long-term targets. But like in every country, meeting Germany's climate goals means accelerating sectoral change, especially in transport, buildings, and industry. And therefore, energy efficiency, low carbon technology, circular economy solutions, industrial electrification all play a role. And finally, we need a fair transition. Climate policies must be aligned with social policies, so nobody gets left behind, because otherwise we won't meet our national or international commitments.
Thank you, Jan. And just to close down these points, thank you that you've elaborated quite balanced in terms of what's advanced and what hasn't. If you could express this idea to a minister in the German national government in a short sentence, how would you phrase that advice or that sentence?
I think climate action is not only part of one sector or of one policy, it has to be included in all sectors and in every decision making that's happening. Just what I said in the beginning. Yeah.
That's right. And I truly hope that they take this advice as somewhere where they need to start these discussions. As you mentioned, it's important to drop emissions faster in some of these critical aspects, but also making sure that strategies and plans and policy is set up to be fast, not just set up to be there, but to be fast enough. I think that's also critical. So in order to start winding down our time at the end, thank you so much for being with us today. I do want to ask you about your final reflections and your perspectives towards the future. So I see that you've identified certain challenges, but also have quite clarity about what's positive that's taken place in these past 10 years. So in spite of all of this, if you could tell us a little bit about what gives you hope today that you think did not exist 10 years ago.
So what really gives me hope today is that history isn't written yet. So we still have the power to shape the future. And unlike 10 years ago, we know exactly what needs to be done. And the tools are all on the table. And there are some states who are using those tools and who are already taking ambitious steps. And I think the combination of knowledge, technology, social momentum, and practical solution gives me real optimism that we can meet the challenges ahead. And of course, one point of hope really are the renewable energy increase in the last years, because it has made incredible progress in many places. It's actually outperformed all previous projections, and that's a huge sign that change is possible. And I would say that are things that gives me hope.
Thank you so much, Tia. I think we all share our positive, hopeful side. Very glad and enthusiastic to hear about yours. I hope that our audience also feels close to this important evidence-based fact that renewable energy has taken up a lot of speed. And also what you mentioned about technology, that's also very important. Many things have changed in these 10 years. And I think this combines quite rationally with the point that you were making before about UNFCCC reform. We can't just negotiate a new deal, which is, I think, what you were trying to tell us, but we need to think about now we have a framework. So we need to make sure that the UNFCCC delivers on on supporting the implementation for the deals that have already been negotiated. And I think this is going to be quite a challenge for the international system. But we're talking more about the delivery and the implementation. So in that case, I think that what makes you hopeful, I think, can also make everyone else hopeful, not just in Germany, but in the rest of the world. So thank you very much, Thea. I'm afraid that we've run out of time for today. We do want to thank Thea Uhlich for joining us today on climate transparency, and thanks to all of our audience for listening in. Remember that you can find the A Decade from Paris Country Notes collection with Germany's Germanwatch and Thea Uhlich collection insights on our website, climate-transparency.org. What do you make of these 10 years of climate action? Feel free to send us your comments. You can find us on LinkedIn and Instagram as Climate Transparency. Thank you and see you on the next one.